For this evening, we're going to have a talk from Professor Davies for approximately follow that. I'm going to encourage you to ask as many questions as you would like. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Davies first. She is an associate professor in the philosophy department at Queen's University, where I did my graduate work. She's also got a cross appointment in the Department of Gender Studies. Her areas of specialization are feminist thought, Jewish philosophy, narrative reasoning, and critical thinking. Some noteworthy publications related to what the talk is on this evening include discussions of pornography and objectification. Recently, in 2015, she was awarded the Alumni Award for Excellence in Teaching, which is a very prestigious award at her institution. So professionally, it's a great pleasure to introduce her to you, and personally, she served as a role model for me and a mentor. Actually, I taught my first course alongside her, which was really her teaching course, and me trying to desperately keep up. But I'm grateful for her being here, and it's a personal honor for me to introduce her as well. So join me in welcoming Dr. Davies.
Can everyone hear me well enough? I am always nervous at the beginning of an academic year, every year, and I was kind of nervous in the half hour before talk started here. But then when I see people in the room, it helps, and I'm really glad to see so many, I'm guessing, students, so that's terrific. I think I'll just dive right in. So this title of my talk, Social Justice and Sexual Exploitation, Reframing 21st Century Prostitution Law Reform. So although this is this presentation is part of the Institute of Applied Ethics, I'm not really trying to apply ethics so much as reframe what's going on after looking at a sort of applied situation or legal, an area of law. Because there's some funny things going on, in my view, legally in the kinds of law reform that's been happening in the 21st century. So I'm trying to rethink some fairly fundamental concepts after looking at some oddities, I think some oddities in the law. So, what is the correct name for a person who is paid for sexual activity? Now, keeping in mind that the person who's paid here is the person who's directly engaging in the sexual activity, not someone paid for somebody else's engaging in sexual activity. I wonder if you would be kind enough to volunteer. What do you think? Yeah, what would you say?
Sex worker?
Sex worker? Yeah.
I'd have to say from my background, it's always been prostitute.
You would say prostitute? Anyone go for victim? You guys are so behind. Yeah.
I would say you could go with any of them, depending on the situation.
Depending on the situation, what kind of situational differences would it make?
Like if it is like abuse, then maybe you are a victim.
Okay, great. So yeah, I mean, there are very different connotations there. And in truth, all of these things, all of this language is used in different contexts. It doesn't really matter so much whether somebody's being hurt or not, because that happens or doesn't happen in most different jurisdictions. It has to do with the legal framework that's operating, or the discourse, the moral framework that's operating. Yeah, so that's kind of interesting. So victim of sexual exploitation is the correct answer according to the Nordic model. And the Nordic model is probably the most influential model for reforming, that is changing law that has anything to do with commercial sex, or people being paid for sex. And it's called Nordic because the first place this occurred was in Sweden, and the law there is called the Kvinnofrid law, which is translated as the violence against women law, because it was broader than paid sex, it also had to do with sexual harassment in the workplace. And there was a lot of discussion generally about violence against women. So actually, more literally, benefit translates as peace for women. We should have peace finally. So starting there in 1999, and it's since been adopted, or some version of it has been adopted in a number of countries, including France, Norway, and very recently, Canada. So in Canada, we got a new law called the Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act. You wouldn't know from that title what it was about, but it's actually criminalizing some activities related to commercial sex. And that came into force on December 6th, 2014. It was a conservative government that brought this in, probably one of the most conservative governments we've had in a long time. And they brought that in a year after the previous law had been ruled unconstitutional. The previous law, which is the kind of law that is being reformed in most places where the law is being reformed, did not make either the buying or the selling of sex illegal. What was illegal was soliciting, so bugging people. So this is framed usually as nuisance. Like the issue is really nuisance, not morality, but nuisance. And roughly, well, probably disproportionately, the people selling sex, mostly women, but not entirely, would get picked up for soliciting more often than people asking for sex or offering to buy the sex. But under the law, either could be prosecuted. People who were engaged in the trade as workers brought a case up layers and layers of the courts, finally to the Supreme Court, and the argument was that this was unfair, this was unconstitutional because it unequally or unfairly threatened the safety and the life of people who were engaged in lawful activity, right? So selling sex is not illegal, but the law made the lives of people who were selling sex dangerous. Because if they were getting picked up and harassed by the police, they would go into places that would sort of hide away, dark places, for example, or be indoors in places that are not always safe, and also not be able to access the police very well because the police saw them as illegal. And there was a lot of violence, and there was a series of very high-profile murders. Eventually, the person associated with those, Robert Fichten, was convicted of dozens of murders. Many of the people that he killed were sex workers. So this is kind of going on in the background. And there is also a high level of violence associated with street sex work. So that was the background argument. The Ontario judge, so the provincial, like state level judge, was convinced that was fine. The government appealed it, went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was convinced as well. This is a kind of unfairness. So the law was struck down, so there was a legal vacuum. But the court gave the government, the federal government, a year to come up with new law. So there was sort of a truce for a year, and then after a year, this law is what the conservative federal government came up with. Perhaps cynically, many of the people that brought the original case think that this is probably unconstitutional as well, but then you have to take it through the courts again. It's just different enough that it would have to be relitigated. But it raises, that the language of this law raises some other interesting questions about where the harm is precisely. Because there's clearly an imagined harm, that's probably different in the imagination of a conservative government than in the feminist, left-wing Swedish government that brought in the Kvinnofrid law. And in fact, that law was very influenced by the work of the American feminist jurisprudence thinker Catherine McKinnon. So it's actually an American influence on that Swedish model. So there's different thinking going on probably, but similar language. Interestingly, the Canadian government was very keen to insist that the Canadian law was not Nordic, but made in Canada, which I think is worth taking seriously in some ways, why there's an attachment, a nationalist attachment to what's going on here. And I think that's connected to this communities issue. So just briefly, what the Nordic model does in Sweden, France, and Canada is criminalize the purchase of sex, also third-party profits, people who are often called pimps. I think that language is really question-begging, but that's the kind of language that the government uses. And brothels. Actually, the language in Canadian law is common body houses, which is to say a place where, we used to say a place where prostitution or other indecent things are happening. Now the word prostitution is no longer in the body house definition, it's just indecent, and that's undefined. So exactly what a body house is not really clear. So being paid for sex, though, is not criminal. So this means the police are not going to charge the person who gets paid. The person who used to be called a prostitute in Canadian law, even though it wasn't illegal, it was mentioned, or amongst the activists who were wanting to get rid of the law, decriminalize, call themselves sex workers. So the prostitute or the sex worker disappears discursively, and that's replaced by prostituted persons. So in any discussions, it's now prostitute, so it's a passive construction. So the people who are now criminally chargeable, the purchasers and pimps, are to blame, and all the focus is put on them. The prostitute is not there, and the background argument is, well, it's unfair. They're being harmed. They're being prostituted, presumably by somebody other than themselves, is the implication. So they are blameless. So why worry about this language? I think we can notice what's going on with these different frameworks. So the framework of prostitution gives us terms like purchasers, pimps, and prostitutes. This is actually the language that was used by the government in its background papers and all its media. The PPPs, interesting. Purchasers is funny because in a neoliberal economy, normally being a purchaser is not a bad thing. It's a good thing to purchase stuff, but it becomes a bad. Pimps, I think, is very racially loaded in North America, that word, and I think that's also not accidental with this government. And prostitutes. So when you're thinking that way, what you're pointing to is blameworthy agency on the part of all of those people. Right? Whether you want it criminal or not, that language is derogatory. It connotes blameworthiness. It connotes bad agency, but agency nonetheless. Right? Sexual commerce uses language that connotes also agency, but agency that's legal and respectable. Respectable insofar as it's got the respect due a worker, right? So you can then claim the rights of a worker and try and access labor law. So that changes the moral connotation, but we also have agency. The Nordic model targets exploited agents and promises to rescue prostituted persons, whom it renders as blameless moral patients. So we lose the status of agent, and we are replacing it with moral patients, the victims of sexual exploitation. in the Nordic model. Not just these sexually exploited persons. The other victim that's right in the label of the Canadian law is the community. So the 2014 Canadian law, Protection of Community and Exploited Persons Act, imputes a vulnerability to victimization of some sort through sexual exploitation. So this is imputed to the community as well as to the prostituted individuals. In a sort of parallel way, although the vulnerability of the community is clearer in the Swedish case, in the rationale for the Swedish Kvinnofrid law, there was an articulation of the need to protect and defend and uphold a shared Swedish national value, namely the value of gender equality. And so the claim was that prostitution threatens not just individuals, it threatens gender equality for the whole society. So it doesn't matter if an individual says, or if in an individual case, I'm not being exploited. Even if that's true, this law says, yeah, maybe, but the whole society is impacted by this trade in a way that's harmful to the community. How exactly the community is threatened in Canada is less clear. It's not been as clearly articulated. And it's not really credible that the issue is gender equality. If you look at the measures of equality, whether they're economic or legal, in the past 20 years, there's been an objective loss in gender equality. So the status of women has decreased. And that the burden of inequality is, as in many other places, borne disproportionately by women who are also racialized or indigenous or disabled or so multiply oppressed. But big gender gap, big wage gap, big wealth gap, violence, similar rates as they've ever been. So it's not really plausible that that's a value except that one that you might do lip service to. Where it is plausible in Sweden, they actually have much better objective measures. Canada might claim to value it, but in practice it doesn't cash out to very much. So there's a couple of kinds of problems produced here. One is the conflation of the threat to persons, individuals, and the threats to community interest or values. So I'm not claiming that we can't have both those kinds of threats. I think we can. But where they're not clearly defined, you can have slippage between the two meanings. And that's very much, I think, the case in Canada. And in the case in a lot of discussion about the harmfulness of prostitution, it tends to slip between these two meanings. And as I suggested in Canada, there's a problem of vagueness. What exactly is being threatened here? If you look at policing and when police forces or governments get really excited about commercial sex, in Canada, it usually has to do with property values. So if there's gentrification or new developments, that's when there'll be a concern about cleaning up the street. And all sorts of street economy gets moved. So this becomes a way to use that. So in a sense, that's a community value, property, or at least property relations. But that's not being explicitly said. It's just if you look at patterns of policing, that kind of looks like what's really going on. So the question about, is it really shared? Obviously, some people benefit more than others from certain kinds of property relations. The other kind of problem that's been articulated in criticisms of the Nordic model is the problem of this concept of victimhood displacing agency. This is coming very much, this complaint very much from sex workers and their allies who are saying we're not poor, helpless, passive victims. We're agents who are making choices about how to live our lives, how to best live our lives. They're not saying we don't get hurt, They wouldn't have brought the case to the Supreme Court in the first place if people weren't getting hurt. They're getting hurt. But they're saying, you know, the hurts there are things like murder, assault, theft. We don't need a new law to recognize those kinds of victimization. We just need enforcement of those laws. Right? But, you know, vis-a-vis getting paid for sex, the claim is that is not in itself same-sex workers where we're victimized. But the Nordic law says, no, that is where people are victimized. Okay. I kind of understand where that criticism is coming from, but I don't entirely agree with it. Because recognizing victim status doesn't necessarily undermine agency. Right? So if there really is victimization going on, we should recognize it. So obviously, assault victims are victims. Assault victims suffer actual or threatened bodily harm, to which they don't consent. It's not just the harm, but it's the fact that it's done against my will. Theft victims lose not just their property, but the ability to dispose of their property as they choose. So if you take my bottle of water, I've lost the bottle of water, but I've also lost the opportunity to give it to you. I might have wanted to give it to you, or give it to somebody else, right? But if the thief takes away that possibility as well. So the losses of these kind of victims reflect threats to what they will, what they want to do, in addition to their interests, like not being harmed or not losing your property. And my claim here is these kinds of victimhoods, these kinds of threats that create victimhood are threats, well, when we recognize them, when we recognize that assault is a crime that creates victims, and theft is a crime that creates victims, we're affirming the agency of those victims, saying, yeah, it's hard to be an agent if you have to worry about being beaten up or having your stuff taken. I think Hobbes said something about that. You know, we can barely think if we're always worrying about being beaten up or having our stuff taken. So this kind of victimhood is perfectly compatible with and even supports agencies. But what about sexual exploitation? Is that the similar kind of victimhood? So I've got some examples here. I've made up abstract examples where I teach and Chris went to university. We used to not say Sam and Pat, it's always X and Y, and actually resisted the urge to say X and Y, and I gave X and Y names. So Sam and Pat have sexual contact, they both agree to it, no one pays, no one's a victim. So this is on the Nordic law. Sam and Pat have sexual contact that Sam doesn't want. Sam clearly says no to it, so Sam has been sexually assaulted. We don't have rape law in Canada, we have sexual assault law. So I'm not quite sure how that would translate into law here, but in Canada that would clearly be sexual assault. Monetary, so if Pat then gives Sam money, that doesn't change anything. The crime is the sexual assault. Oh, should be below that, should be 3, not the second 2. Sam and Pat have sexual contact that they both agree to. Pat pays Sam what Sam wants to be paid. You'd think everyone would be happy, but no, Sam is a victim there of sexual exploitation, and Pat is a criminal on the Nordic law. We haven't even got into what kind of sexual contact. Just if it's sexual contact and there's pay, that's the legal outcome. On the other hand, if Sam and Pat have sexual contact that they both agree to and that Sam wants to pay for, but Pat doesn't pay Sam, Sam is not a victim of sexual exploitation. And Pat, you sort of think intuitively something's gone wrong there, but there's no crime. Or at least one that would be really hard to enforce in that case. if you could come up with a way of thinking that. So these cases, I think, apply certain rights. So the fact that they can have sex where there's no money and nothing illegal goes on means that Sam has the right, so just look at Sam's rights. Sam has a right to have consensual sex. So there might be regimes where it's illegal to have sex if you're not married. That's not the case in Canada. So there's a right to have consensual sex. Sam also has a right to not to be assaulted, sexually or otherwise. So that's why Sam says don't want it, and it happens if it's assault. Sam does not have a right to agree to and expect payment for sex. Because to expect payment for sex would be to expect criminal wrongdoing. So you can't contract with somebody to break the law, for them to break the law. It's like contract killing. It's not a contract. You can't rightfully expect the thing that you contracted to pay to happen. So there's something wrong going on there, some kind of wrongdoing, but what exactly is the wrong? Who or what is wronged? So I want to do a little analysis of exploitation. That seems to be doing the sexual work here. So what exactly is exploitation? There's a couple of senses that usually come into play in these kind of discussions, and they tend to slip into each other. And there's a third that generally doesn't come into play, but that I'm trying out as an alternative. So the first is the Marxist sense, which has to do with unfair pay, basically. Or it could be unfair working conditions, but it has to do with what workers are paid, and to use the technical terms from Marxist theory, exploitation here is the appropriation of surplus value from other people's labor, or paying less than the value that the worker puts into the product. So that's how the owner of the product, the owner of the means of production, gets to make a profit. Because somebody's put in more than they get out of it. That's exploitation according to Marx. Another sense, it's Kantian. Did you study Kant? Anyone rhyme off the categorical imperative? No? Oh, really? So it's not to let people use you, or not to use them, merely as a means, but always also as an end. So it's not that you can't use people, otherwise you'd never have labor contracts, and Kant thought they were okay, sort of. But you can't just use someone. That's where it gets tricky. But this seems intuitively right. I mean, people complain about somebody using you, right? We use this kind of language informally when we think somebody's treating someone else badly. Often in romantic or sexual relationships, or even friendships. We talk about people using each other. Not exactly clear what that is, but it sort of seems intuitively right. The final sort of unusual frame that I'm offering is that of resource appropriation. We talk about exploiting natural resources. And what that means is use for economic growth. And usually when you hear that kind of language, it's a good thing. So the exploitation there is use in a good sense. But there are some instances of it going wrong, because you can have illegitimate appropriation of use of resources. So we would need to look at when is it legitimate and when is it illegitimate. So my argument is that neither the Marxist nor the Kantian sense of exploitation explains what could be going on in the Nordic model, what kind of wrong is happening there. My alternative is to say that the wrong of sexual exploitation on the Nordic model is analogous to the wrong of natural resource exploitation through illegitimate appropriation. I'm not saying that's what the people who propose or enact the Nordic model have in mind, but I'm saying that's the way that it makes best sense conceptually. And I want to set it up that way, actually, so that I can say that's what I think is going on, and here's why that's a wrong thing to do. So I'm not advocating this, but I am trying to make sense of what's really going on under the surface. Okay? The second part of my argument is that the conditions under which the exploitation of sex as a resource is illegitimate and wrong, I think will turn out to depend on the role of sex in community-defining institutions or values. And then finally, the social justice implications may be revealed through an analysis of how injustices work and how sexuality as a social resource has been historically constructed. So what we think sex is, or to make it clearer, what is sexy, who is sexy, what kinds of things are sexy, is not just a natural fact, is part of my claim. It's an effect of all kinds of histories. Right? So how these resources work and who accesses them and how has a historical component. And that's where we'll find, I think, the source of some of the social injustices. So I think, fairly enough, people can say, yeah, I want to be on the side of sex workers, but gosh, how is it that most of the people involved as workers tend to be people who are part of groups that are dominated or oppressed? Women more than men, LGBTQ people more than straight people, migrants, very often, racialized people, indigenous people. So, gosh, there's probably vulnerability there, what's going on. I think we need to look at background histories of what constitutes sexiness, rather than focusing on the money exchange in the present. So, just briefly, why I'm rejecting the Marx. Not because I don't think we can think of sex work as work, we can. It certainly is understood that way by sex worker activists and allies. And sex workers clearly can be subjected to health and safety threats in poor working conditions like other workers. They can be paid at unfair rates or charged unfair fees for the opportunity to work. That's the case in Canada where it's legal to be a stripper. But to be a stripper, you have to pay the bar or the strip club for the privilege of getting on stage. You pay a performance fee. In Germany, where sex work has been legal since 2002, and it's mega business, most cases where sex work happens, it's not that the sex worker is an employee of an establishment. They're freelancers, and they rent rooms from the people who own the establishment. And by establishment, for example, in Cologne, there's an 11-story brothel called the Pasha Club. And they're chains. So this is really big business. So exploitation in the Marxist sense occurs big time. And it occurs also a lot in the way that it occurs in North America and in many other places, especially to migrant workers. People who are particularly vulnerable because of their delicate status in the country and language problems, and the fact that they've moved, usually for economic reasons, or because of desperation from moving from political or military instability. So these are vulnerable workers. So for sure they're vulnerable. But that's not what the Nordic model is worried about. Those are legitimate things to worry about, but the Nordic model is not worried about. Canada sort of paid lip service to being concerned about those kind of things by saying we'll put money into rehabilitating or helping these folks get better lives. And so the money that they offered to put into it was 20 million Canadian, which is peanuts, especially with the exchange rate. But it's peanuts when you look at the size of the problem. That's not the way to resolve it. Why not Kant? Well, there's like two layers of reasons. One is if you take Kant at his word about what follows from the categorical imperative, the only sex that's permitted is within heterosexual, monogamous marriage made with a lifelong vow. Right? And that's the only time it could be wrong. In every other case, including solo sex, there is use going on. Use of yourself, or letting somebody else use you, or you are using somebody else for pleasure or profit. So even just pleasure is, for him, a kind of use that violates the categorical imperative. That can't be what the Nordic law has in mind, because in the countries where it's applied, non-marital consensual sex is legal. Right? And there's no explicit effort to make it illegal, so that's really inconsistent. But maybe we can be a bit more charitable to a Kantian approach and say, well, can we get a sort of modified Kant? So this sense in which we talk about people using each other in friendships or in sexual or romantic relationships, maybe that's what we're objecting to. And we shouldn't use people that way or let ourselves be used in that way. We should only have sex for the right reasons. Anyone heard that phrase lately? Nobody else watched junk television like I do? That's the repeated refrain on The Bachelor and The Bachelorette. No fans? I'm sort of ambivalent, it's like watching a car crash. You can't watch it. I just find it, it's like junk food. It is for the right reasons. That is very Kantian, right? That is Kant's thing. Don't use somebody as a means only, but always also as an end. So there's got to be a reason that you're using someone, and that reason has to be right, meaning moral. So in respecting the person's purpose, like the reason they're letting themselves be used, you are not just using them, you're respecting the purposes they have. And that's perfectly good according to Kant. Now he says the only right reason you could have for letting yourself be used sexually or using somebody sexually is for the perfectly good purpose of affirming that the reproduction of the species is a good thing. So this doesn't mean, to be clear, that you're having sex with someone in order to have a child, because that would be using them. But you're saying being open to that as an outcome is a respectable thing. And you can only do it if you do, it's just metaphysical magic of Kant. You promise each other exclusivity, and you sort of subordinate yourself totally to the other person, and you think, surely he doesn't want subordination. But then he says, yeah, but when it's mutual and total, it cancels out. Right, so this is the only place that you can use each other and it's not use. Okay. So we still have some intuitive appeal for this right reasons business, but boy, is it vague. And I'm never really clear on The Bachelorette what they think the right, the wrong, or right reasons are. I mean, ostensibly, it's also about, well, we want to get married. But obviously, that's not why most people are there. So and it's so inconsistent with actual dominant sexual morality. People don't think you have to get married. Okay. Could it be deception? I mean, and this is also a theme in The Bachelor and Bachelorette. I was hoping that cultural reference would be meaningful. Is it? So the sort of dramatic moments are finding out so-and-so is not here for the right reasons. Right? He's really got a girlfriend on the side, or really wants to get a singing contract or a magazine modeling contract or whatever it is. Right? So that the moral wrong in those cases seems to be deception. So you can imagine someone saying something like, you know, I really thought he loved and respected me, this person I'm in a sexual romantic relationship, but he just wanted arm candy. Maybe not me, but I mean, somebody might say that, right? Or really wanted access to all my political connections, or, you know, my reflected glory, or whatever someone might get into a relationship for, and the person thought it was, you know, true love, but it turns out it wasn't. You would feel used. Fine. But that can't be what's going on with the Nordic model, because sex for pay is mostly non-deceptive. More so than in most relationships, right? It's very clear what the terms are. And if possible confusion about motives did make sex for pay sexual exploitation, then many sexual relations should come under legal scrutiny, including marriage. And people marry for all kinds of reasons, including economic dependence. So it looks an awful lot like prostitution if you're worried about pay being involved in that. But that's not what the Nordic solution is proposing. And in Canada, there's actual exemptions for third parties benefiting from someone being paid for sex if they're in a legitimate relationship. It's not spelled out that a legitimate relationship there could be a marriage, but it sounds rather like someone who might be accused of being a pimp if they weren't married might be less likely to be accused of being a pimp if they are married. When one person is being paid for sex coming from somebody else. So that's definitely not what's going on in the Nordic case. What are we doing for time? Okay. So what I've been trying to rule out is the idea that the harm of sexual exploitation, I think, is not the harm of violating the rights of an agent, not an unfair contract between agents, and not a case of deceiving someone so as to get what you want. Perhaps it's not about harming someone, but improperly using something, where the something might be an abstract something. I'm not quite sure what that something is, but it doesn't seem to be about agents. It doesn't seem to be about subjects. There seems to be an object of exploitation. The idea, by the way, of object of exploitation sort of came to my mind, sort of inspired by Patricia Williams' brilliant article on being the object of property, in which she alludes to what it means to be an African-American feminist contract lawyer with a consciousness of the value of contracts when you're trying to get equality, but also knowing the history of slavery and the history of being born of rape. Right? That an ancestor, she says when she started law school, her mother said to her, don't be nervous, remember the Williamses were lawyers. And the Williams in question was the sort of ancestral owner. So she has an ancestor who's both an owner and a lawyer, and an ancestor who's owned. And so we do have a history. So this is an example of where we've got the history of social injustice that actually involves people being objects. And there's a sexualization involved there. Okay. That's a bit further than where I'm at right now. So it's not like the Kantian, treating someone as an object in the Kantian sense. And some critics of the Nordic model have suggested, interestingly, that Catherine McKinnon's earlier objections to pornography and that the influence on Nordic prostitution law was kind of Kantian. Radical feminists and kind of Kantian, reducing effectively all heterosexual sexual relations to involving objectification, because the background inequalities are so great. I don't think that's what's intended, because there's no sort of critique of marriage, at least in the Canadian version. So I want to look at the impropriety of using something in a way that generates improper rights claims, particularly property rights claims. And the model for my analysis is Locke's account of self-ownership as a generator of private property when it's admixed, I love that word, with not privately owned natural resources. Should we talk about Locke here? No? Okay, well, I will talk about Locke. That's what I'm going to do. So, sexual exploitation might be this kind of a wrong if sexuality is, as I suggest, a social resource that's owned in common, that's analogous to natural resources that have not yet been transformed into the private property. So Locke is an early social contract theorist, talks about the state of nature, and in the state of nature, nothing's owned yet. How do you get to own stuff? Well, you put your labor into it, as long as you leave enough and as good a kind. Yeah, there are a couple of other restrictions, but that's the main gist of it. Part of the theory involved when Locke comes up with it is he's trying to explain how private property is possible if God, and he's not really worried, I think, about theology here, but it's kind of the way that folks talk in that context. So if the world is given to us in common, given by God, so if it's given by God, then it's sort of property already. So that does a lot of theoretical work for him. And properties there are given, right? So the next problem is how do we sort of get it individually? And he says reason, so we're shifting from God to reason, tells us it's better if we find a way to use it, rather than just leaving stuff because, we don't have an individual right to it, and that gets in the way of using stuff. That doesn't sound reasonable. We've got all these things that we could be making good products with. So he says that's better, and that makes good sense. So the solution is, well, the only thing we own personally and privately already is ourselves, not just our bodies, but our capacity to do things. We own that because God's given that property right as well. And since I own myself, and I put a part of myself into, say, the land that I plant in and look after and so on, if I had ownership myself, I sort of magically transformed the land into something different. Not just made it fertile or made it grow something, I've made it property. That's more metaphysical magic, I think. But it's really dominant metaphysical magic. That's how we talk about property. So impropriety of appropriation has to do with taking too much. At least in that first instance, moving out of the state of nature. So if you don't leave enough and as good in common, then you've got improper use. Okay? So for the most part, resource appropriation is a good thing on this kind of a theory, but there is the conceptual space to imagine how it might not be, if you haven't left enough for the commons, for the community, or for potential other users. So now I'm going to make the analogy with the sexual case. So like whatever might be put into the land, I'm going to say that a person has the capacity to generate sexual pleasure in another who has the capacity to experience it. Sexuality, which is sort of vague and amorphous, is given to us in common. You could say by God, but I'm not going to claim that. I think it's given by history. But it's there. Like, what counts as sexy or not sexy is not just a function of what I think it is. It's already in the culture before I do anything, or anyone does anything. And then with action, one can intentionally act so as to generate sexual pleasure in another. Here's a kind of Lockean move. Someone who does this invests themselves, partly at least, in the other. So, thinking parallel to Locke, although he doesn't allow us to have property in other people, but just extending this. So the sexual pleasure that is generated is at least partly, on this theory, by the one who generates it. That's a problem, because we can't own other people. Think of Shakespeare trying to get the pound of flesh. I can't sort of, I mean, how would you get the sexual pleasure out of someone? I say, I made that, I'm going to take it. You can't. So what would you do then? How would you deal with that? If both parties want it to happen, you say, well, I will relinquish my ownership claim if you pay me actual something that can be transferred like money. Right? So I have a property claim, I can't actually get it, I'll give it up if you give me some money. Okay? So that could be achieved by the person who generates the sexual pleasure negotiating away with fee the claim on the sexual product, where the sexual product is the experiencer's experience of pleasure. I've set this up as if the pleasure is one-sided. In actual cases, it may or may not be, but just to set it up theoretically, we can imagine it being that way at least sometimes. And that's all we need. So if the other person gets any pleasure out of it, that's accidental. The other person doesn't have to try. Seems kind of far-fetched, huh? Yeah, it does. And so I'm afraid of putting this kind of theory out there, because it does seem kind of weird. But let's look at cases where we don't think it's so weird. In the monogamous marriage contract, there's a promise to exclusively make available, this is not explicit usually, but it's kind of understood when you get upset at a marital partner's infidelity. There's a promise to exclusively make available to one spouse one's capacity to experience sexual pleasure and to exclusively invest one's capacity to generate sexual pleasure in one's spouse, and only there. It doesn't mean that anyone will actually get any pleasure. It just means if there's going to be any investing and experiencing, it's just going to be between us. That's the promise. And I'm claiming that's a little bit like, that's the kind of thinking that's going on in my version of the Lockean account. The spouses, and this is kind of a country version, the spouses make this promise reciprocally, so they mutually own themselves as a new entity, the couple, it's maybe not the country. So there's this new thing that's created, the couple, and we both own it. Or, on the country version, there's no ownership claim. It's kind of cancel each other out. Either way, there's not an uneven claim. But there is a claim. And we actually have some rights over the other person. And we have a right to complain if things go differently. And well, let's think of the non-marital cases. What do we think is going on there? Why does Sam and Pat have a right to have sex? So I'm suggesting in the background, 2 or more partners in consensual non-marital sex scenarios generate claims, I'm suggesting, on each other's sexual pleasure. I'm doing something in you for you, but implicitly agree not to make a claim. So implicitly agree to relinquish those claims. So they make investments in each other, but instead of claiming payment, they give up the claims, they give it away in multiple senses. There might be mutual enjoyment, there might not, but either way, it's a gift economy. Right? It's kind of like a potluck. Right? It's not tit for tat exchange, it's not an exchange economy, but there is gifting. And with gifting, the gift that you give is owned by you. It's property. My casserole is property, but I give it to you. And I don't have a claim on your cheesecake. I don't have a right to claim that you should give me cheesecake because I brought a casserole. I hope you do, but. So the puzzles that remain on this model. Why is it that commercial sex counts as improperly taking too much? We're okay with lots of sex happening as long as it's gifted. We're okay with restricted property claims if it's monogamous. But these exchanges are a problem and somehow exploited. How is that improper here? I think on this model somehow it is, but I haven't figured that out yet. And weirdly, minus financial inducement. So somebody says, come on, invest in me. You know, put your labor into giving me pleasure, and I'll induce you with paying you. How is that exploitive? Right? Often in criticisms of pornography, that's said to be coercive, right? Because we're talking about people who are often poor, and they're making them do something they wouldn't otherwise do. That's wage labor. Right? In any other case, we don't say offering somebody money for something is coercion. I mean, there can be background coercions, but suppose we get rid of those. It's inducement. Why would inducement be exploited? And what assumptions about sexuality make the person against whom the property claims are made, the person who pays the fee, that's the exploiter, rather than the person who's the sexual pleasure manufacturer who makes the property claim. So why is the buyer the exploiter rather than the person who's investing and getting paid? Now, I think the short answer there is that it's easier to pass the law in a way that says these are the bad guys and these are the innocent victims in a certain political context. And the intuition that there is something uneven going on comes from the background of social injustices. But looking at the actual exchange, it's not obvious that one should be exploiting the other not, or that anyone there is exploiting anyone. So that's my final question. How do historical social injustices create or generate sexuality as a social resources that we are given in common? And looking at that in conjunction with the blocking kind of idea, I think might make some more sense of the intuition that there's social injustices happening here without saying the people involved are doing the wrong thing. There's background wrong things going on. Thanks for your investment of time and attention to my talk.
So we now have some time put aside for you to ask some questions if you'd like, and I encourage you all to do so. Keep your hand up until I acknowledge you, and then you can put it down, and I can attempt to remember the order in which they were raised. Don't all jump at once.
So I was hoping to just clarify a little bit more about the lock-in part of the account here, right? Because it's of course the case that if you're a lock-in, you can put a whole lot of labor into someone else's land and acquire no claims whatsoever, because even if you put your labor into it, it's someone else's land, right? And so as I see it, it seems like part of your account to say, well, if a person puts sexual effort into another person, they acquire some sort of right to them, at least the pleasure that they've given in some sense. But that seems to imply to a certain extent that the person did not have ownership to begin with in their experiences. Right? So it seems to me that it's intuitive to think if I own myself, I own not just the choices of what I do with my body, but I own my internal life. And so that seems contrary to the model we put forward. So I'm just hoping that.
So rephrase your question. I'm treating the person who's invested in as kind of virgin territory.
It's they don't own their experience.
How's that happening? I think that's actually, that play on words is actually more relevant than we might think, because I think that's part of the threat to community is, either those persons are virgins, children, like that who are being influenced by prostitutes or sex workers hanging contaminating them. So their sexuality, they're accidentally getting invested in just by seeing sex workers. Or they're not virgins, and then they're backed. That's one kind of level of answer. A more apt answer to what I think you're getting at is, well, we've got self-ownership, so this isn't a state of nature, right? Yes, but in the case of investing my labor into land that somebody else owns, then we've got the Marxist problem, right? Then we're talking about what kind of contracts am I going to make with someone who owns the means of production. And then we can look at exploitation in that sense, right? But we don't. So I think there's this kind of intuition about sexuality being a different kind of thing. I mean, and here's where the gender dimensions come into play. Because on Locke's story, there's all kinds of labor that's excluded as labor that can produce property. Namely, most of the work that women do, or traditionally women have done. And then as privileged women do it less and less, more and more marginalized, poorer people in the world end up doing it. So reproductive labor, right? Labor that involves actually doing work on other people doesn't generate you a claim on that person. That's kind of interesting and paradoxical. So that actually kind of explains how come there's this inequality of wealth. Right? I might get paid, to reproduce my labor day to day, but I'm never going to get anything like the value that I put into another person, say nursing a sick person. I'm not going to be seen to be producing something. So there's that distinction between productive and reproductive labor. Sexuality, affective labor, or affective activity. My argument is saying we should take that seriously. There is something going on there. Is that anything like an answer? Good.
So if we're talking as, if we're looking at like the person that's exposing themselves to sex as a victim, then like what would you say about like a drug dealer who's selling drugs? Would that make them the victim?
Can you fill that out a little bit more? I'm not quite seeing that.
So like if you are paying someone to have sex with you and you're considering that person who's getting paid to be a victim, so like look at it from like a drug perspective, like someone selling drugs. We were kind of talking about this in class before, so I was wondering like how you would relate that.
So the person who sells the drugs is transferring the drug in the way that the sex worker transfers capacity to generate pleasure? Is that the parallel?
No, like the drug dealer is getting paid for giving some drugs.
Right.
And often drug dealers are abused for, in movies, because I never experienced like drug dealing myself, but so like would you consider them the victim?
No, but I think I'm not understanding the analogy.
I think she's just kind of asking why
yeah,
the
the next.
person's a victim. Because usually, I mean, not always, but you would think the victim is someone like, they're not asking for it, but some people, like, sex work, they should. Yeah, because they're selling to do it.
Well, the sex worker is asking for pay.
Yeah.
So it's the drug dealer.
And so the drug dealer is asking for pay,
Yeah, so I think she's trying to
right?
see it.
So the difference in Canada, in fact, when the Canadian law came up, that comparison was made. Well, why are you saying we can't regulate sex work when we can obviously regulate the drug trade? And we can require that drug dealer not happen on the streets, and we, if that makes their life harder, too bad. The difference was that selling drugs was illegal. And the rationale for making selling drugs illegal is that the drugs harm someone. Right? They make the person who takes the drugs sick in the long term. Okay? So the claim with the sex work is So that's where there's a disanalogy, at least as it was explained. Now, you might have a view of that. I mean, people who are pro-Nordic models say the sex worker is being hurt, always. Yeah,
What if they're given STDs?
you don't have to get paid to get that. So there's absolutely, sexuality is a way to transmit disease. And romantic and sexual relationships can involve a world of hurt without pay. Right? So what is it about pay that makes it bad? You know, if having multiple partners was the problem, I mean, that's usually what's said, well, a sex worker has lots of sex. If having multiple partners was the problem, we regulate that, and we don't. Yes?
I think my question is similar. How we've been saying that the buyer is the exploiter, so then how much accountability, if any, should be on the consumer partner?
What do you think?
I think it should depend on the situation, but I don't think it's fair to say that in every situation there's no accountability whatsoever, that they shouldn't have any consequences.
Accountability, though, for what? When the account, demanding that somebody be accountable seems to suggest that there's something going on that shouldn't, that it's harmful. So this might help me understand what the wrong is. So what should the sex worker be accountable for? What have they done that needs an accounting?
Perhaps accepting the money, if the buyer is being accountable for giving the money, should the
Right? But why is accepting money for payment for service, giving a service? Right? Ordinarily, we say getting paid for giving a service is a good thing in our economy. So why is this instance of getting paid for something doing something wrong?
well, on the flip side, why is providing pay for the service something wrong?
I agree with you. I don't see that it's obviously the case that it is. Right? So the Nordic model folks say yes, because what happens is, probably this is mystery, what happens is something like the Kantian problem. Right? If sexual services are being sold, that requires that the person who gets the money makes themselves into a product to be bought. And you make a person into a thing. That's not okay. That's kind of Kantian intuition. But why don't we say that for any other service, right? They get paid a fee for doing something. Why is the gardener or the waiter not objectifying themselves? Why, or the nurse? Or people do all, Martha Nussbaum has an article about this, and she says, you can imagine somebody getting paid for trying out medicines, right? So they have something done to their body that could be quite dangerous. But lots of people do this because they need the money. Or you could imagine being, tested for using medical instruments in perhaps the same intimate places that a sex worker might experience. But we wouldn't say that was wrong. And in fact, in the women's health movement, women taught medical students how to do gynecological exams, and were paid for it. Paid for it better, I should say, than doing a philosophy TA. And I know because they did. Right? And I actually, I haven't otherwise done sex work, but I know that it's sometimes I get a funny response when I tell that story. Because it's like, and I put it on my teaching resume. I have to say, it was one of the best teaching experiences. If you can teach naked with instruments coming at you, it's a really good way to learn to teach. And we thought it was political work, right? We were teaching doctors that patients know stuff and talk back. So we thought we were doing some good political work. Eventually got tired of it. But was that wrong? And you're probably reluctant to tell yes, even if you were wrong.
I encourage them to do so. Backtrack.
So you said before that the people who are most likely to be sex workers are women, because they're oppressed in some ways, and are specifically women of lower socioeconomic status, or that is slaves. So with the refugee crisis right now, and women being having to leave the places where they live, if you're not technically a citizen of somewhere and you are a sex worker, but if you're raped, how would that, in the government, how would you go about filing that case? Or would you even do right back?
Well, you have the problem that any illegal alien has west. And also a lot of migration from Africa and the Indian subcontinent. So it's there. But the biggest is from Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. So part of that was the end of the Cold War. Right? There's this huge disparity of wealth between East and West. Money from the West goes as capital to invest. People and buy up the property there. People there become poor, desperate for work. They don't have the central economy that they used to have. They move west, and they're really cheap, exploitable labor. Within the European Union, it's completely legit to move and find work wherever. So it's not only sex work where this occurs. Another massive area, as it is here, is agricultural labor. And people are terribly exploited here as there, and subjected to really health-threatening, pesticides and crummy living conditions, and often exploited in the Marxist sense that they end up paying the people they're working for room and board and the whole business. So it's tough. I mean, probably many of you have studied this or know folks who've gone through this. It's a really hard position. So yeah, there's all kinds of bad stuff that goes on there because of the volatility.
Yeah. I guess you said like commercial sex was criminalized.
Yeah.
But then in some cases, I guess the third party still benefits if it's marriage. So back to like how you said it's the reason. I guess where I'm confused is where your stance is on the pay. Like, because you keep saying, about like money being a motive kind of thing, and I'm getting the sense that the exploitation is wrong because they're getting paid. But then if you mentioned how, like, in our economy, how that's kind of, the norm is you pay for your services, I'm confused about it. Like,
Yeah, I mean, it is confusing. I mean, the model here, the law, is that there's something special about sex that makes what would otherwise be just fine and dandy, like I do something, you pay me for it. We both agree to it. We don't think we're being hurt, or the hurt is tolerable to us, more tolerable than the alternatives. Okay? But when the transaction has to do with sex, according to the Nordic model, it is always harmful. So you can be being paid thousands and thousands of dollars to have sex with somebody once a year that you've had as a steady customer for 20 years and you quite like. You don't marry them, have them as a partner, but this person's willing to pay for that. That, according to the Nordic model, is harmful. And so I'm asking why? It's not that I'm saying that people who are doing sex work are not often harmed. They are, but in ways that we already have covered, like assault, murder, theft, the Marxist sense of exploitation. Yeah, that's still all bad. How about we enforce those laws? So the sex workers who were killed, and many of them also drug addicts, not all of them very poor, for the most part, well, not all, but mostly poor women. They were noticed as missing by their family and by their friends, especially their associates on the street, for a long time. And the police did not respond. The police said, oh, well, they're sex workers, and sex workers move around. Yeah. I mean, there was just not a lot of police action to help people that they understood as kind of down and out and already vulnerable and likely to die of their lifestyle. Right? But we've got perfectly good laws to protect them.
So you're saying there's laws and more police kind of interaction and it can be safer and not like
Sure.
get victim anymore.
Sure.
Because it could be
There's a sex worker,
or that it wouldn't be harmful.
well, not harmful in the way that the Nordic model is claiming, right? So, I mean, as in agricultural migrant labor, people are still getting hurt, but we don't say that the hurt is because they're paid. We say the hurt is because they're not paid well enough, and the working conditions are not good, right? So we could easily say, okay, if you think somebody's not being paid well enough, they have dangerous working conditions, let's look at that. Whereas instead, there's a report done by an activist group in Ottawa, in Canada, called Power, that documents that a lot of the violence that's experienced by street sex workers is committed by the police, actual violence and failure to protect from other violence and harassment. So people's lives are made worse by the law. In Sweden, they claim that that doesn't happen, but what happens instead is social work intervention. So you get your life, intervened in when you might be better off without it. Yeah.
So, I'm just asking a kind of hypothetical question. Assuming that there's like a set of laws that recognize the agency of sex workers, what if, it seems like every model recognizes that third-party people that benefit from sex workers that would be criminalized. So let's assume,
There are jurisdictions in which it's legal,
okay.
and in which profiting from the work of other people is also legal.
Okay, well what if there was let's assume that it is considered legal. What if there was a group of sex workers themselves who were kind of unionizing in a way, trying to fight for
A cooperative.
a sort of equal standard of pay and certain rights?
Yeah.
What would your stance on that?
My personal stance was actually I'm kind of left-leaning. You might have noticed. I think it's a good thing for any workers. So if that's what the workers involved, if this is the kind of work that they can get, and they can have better lives by being collectively organized, great. One of the jurisdictions where that does happen more often is New Zealand. They decriminalized their solicitation laws, as Canada did, but they didn't put in new ones. So they have kind of light regulation around the working conditions and a lot of support for mutual aid and collective organization. Yeah. In Germany, it's kind of flipped. They made it legal, highly regulated in the way that businesses are regulated, also Nevada is another case. And there's lots of exploitation in the Marxist sense. Like the people who make the big money are the people who own the buildings. Yes?
What was it again? You said if non-marital, if you're having non-marital sex and it's no money involved, it's okay if you both agree on it, right?
I'm saying that I think that our background idea of why that's okay, especially if we're thinking about casual sex, like not with a, you're not thinking you're in a monogamous relationship, but a lot about hookups these days.
Because you both give, is it because you both give?
It's a gift.
But so then if you're if money is involved, then one person is getting more than the other because one person is getting sex and money and the other person is only getting sex.
Well, as in many sexual encounters, there's a question about whether both people are getting sex, right? Often, in all kinds of relationships, whether sexual encounters, whether there's pay or not, it's kind of uneven as to who benefits. That might be a certain kind of problem. In fact, I think it is a certain kind of problem, but it's a different kind of problem. So the pay thing doesn't necessarily change that. Some sex workers say, yeah, with certain customers, I enjoy myself, but often I don't, and that's not why they're there. Or they don't mind if they do.
What is your stance on male brides? Like in third world countries, people are willing to buy virgin brides for
Oh, the mail order brides.
Yeah, the mail order brides. And the thing is, there's a middleman too that actually accepts the money, gets the bride and gets shipped off. Would that be considered prostitution?
No. Well, yes and no. spouse is thinking, I can't get a woman who's going to be the kind of wife I want, except from there. Fine. One of the places where it goes the other way was Cuba. I guess because you've had the embargo here for so long, this is not familiar to you. But in Canada, where we've had a lot of back and forth with Cuba, a lot of Cubans have come to Canada as spouses and then been banned. A lot of those people are men, right? And it's a very similar dynamic. And the first time I went to Cuba, I was shocked to discover myself as a person who was seen correctly as having money. When a young man, beautiful young man, offered to, moreover a medical student, more medical students per square inch there, offered to hang around if he wanted to have a relationship, and he looked like he wanted to get into that relationship. And at first, I'd never been on that side of it, right? And I was busy watching very pale-skinned Europeans sort of taking out the young women, young Cuban women, buying them drinks and all the rest of it. And I was feeling very smug about it, it was so bad. And then suddenly I was in that position. Right? Somebody saw me as a source of income or migration. Well, I was. I didn't realize that. And there is also a market for female buyers of sexual services in other parts of the Caribbean. Jamaica, Haiti, parts of Africa. So this is why I think it's more about background social injustices rather than just a gender problem. So the Nordic model folks tend to see it as purely a gender problem. I think it has to do with who has money and who gets sexualized. So the Caribbean is also sexualized. It's where you go for sun, sand, fun, romance, good times. And people get sexualized as well. And people who have the money to be able to go there and have the fun nowadays also include middle class or wealthier women, mostly white women, but women also who have that buying power.
Or would you view them as victims?
They don't view themselves as victims. They are victims in the Marxist sense.
I think they do view themselves as victims of like the environment they grew up in and the lack of opportunity they have and what they can't do anything in their own country. So they view like, for example, a white male from like America or Europe as like their opportunity of income and stuff.
I think people in that situation may view the richer person with resentment, and I think correctly. But I think, I've read stuff and talked to people who've been in that position, and I rarely hear them talking about themselves as victims. They would emphasize more like, I'm a go-getter, I need to survive, or I need to do well, and if this is what I need to do, then fine. And I'm kind of pulling one over on someone. They're the ones who are getting tricked. Or some people don't even view it as tricking a person, but like, yeah, I'm building a relationship. When you asked about male or brides, my intuition is that's actually historically been the norm, right? That marriage is an economic arrangement. In fact, one of the reasons that Kant didn't get married, he couldn't afford it. Right? The marriage was a thing you could only do if you could support a partner. And the Jane Austen novels are all about, holy cow, who am I going to be able to marry so I can survive? Because that was the only way to do it.
So thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I'm intrigued by your final question about how historical social injustices form our understanding of sexuality. And so I was thinking of at least what is a problem in the U.S. where you have like middle schoolers or high schoolers that take pictures of themselves naked and then they send them off, and then the FBI comes in and says that they're distributing child pornography. And what's interesting in this case is that it seems like they're both a victim and an accountable agent, but yet they victimize themselves, right? And so I'm assuming that this must be partly because the criminalization of child pornography whereas now it's no longer the case. But I'm curious, if you have any thoughts about that.
I don't have an answer, like I don't have the analysis that tells you, but I do agree with you that that's a really good place to look for funny things going on about who you would think of as being the victim or the bad agent.
And there's no money here, which is also
Right.
interesting.
But it does have to do with illegitimate appropriation of sexuality. And we talk also about sexualizing children. So it's like there's this, contamination or accessing of sexuality, and we're sort of out there somehow. And children, as a category, are not supposed to come anywhere near it until magically they come of age. But of course we are near it because it's in the air. I mean, culture, it's culture. Culture is there, we're in it. I think it's kind of moral panic about where the culture's at, but
Could we understand it in terms of the protection of communities and that imagined harm that you were saying?
oh, I think big time, because when the victims are, the people who would have been called sex workers or prostitutes, and on the Nordic model, they're blameless victims, unless there's children around. Then they're perpetrators. So you cannot accept money for sex if you're near a school. So there's actually like a list of places you can't be. So near a place where children reasonably be expected to be, I think is the phrase. School or daycare would be an obvious instance, but the law doesn't specify whether it's midnight. So if you're in a play in the yard of a playground, at a school playground, and that might be a place where people would go. It's not clear. We need to see some case law on whether that's going to count. But that's often part of the argument that it hurts the children. Just to see these people. So again, it's like gentrification, right? That people, somehow sex happens somewhere else, and it's really happening if there's money involved.
So what would be like your stance on soliciting where it's like if women are on the side of the road, it's like marketing themselves in a way? So like if the laws were to change, how would it really be, like where you said location-wise at near school or time-wise after midnight, like I would think that soliciting on the road would be like a public disturbance in a way, whereas when you mentioned earlier the brothel, like a place of prostitution.
So that was the old law.
So like how would that?
So because the problem was soliciting
regulated, like where's that fine line?
theoretically it's the law. Right? So the history of this law in Canada is that the original offense in the earliest Canadian criminal code was that prostitution was a status offense. It was a special kind of vagrancy. So the person didn't have to do anything. They just had to be suspected of being a prostitute and just being on the street. You committed an offense. That was ruled unconstitutional in 1970-something. And they say, we can't have status. We can't just be the wrong kind of person. You have to actually do something wrong. So then they have to think, what is it that these people are doing that we don't like? Well, laws against panhandling also came up around the problem. It aimed at the same people they've always worried about, poor people on the streets. Right? So let's find something they're doing. What are they doing? They're annoying us. They're soliciting. And there's references to disrupting traffic, right? Whether it's pedestrians or cars. And that could be the car slowing down to say, hey, are you going to give me some sex? Or it could be the person saying, hey, do you want it? Right? But it was this annoyance that was the word. Theoretically, you can't stop anyone from that now. But what they do now is harass the prostitutes by basically the police hanging around people that they think are prostitutes or sex workers and getting in the way of the customer, because the customer is going to charge. So the same thing that happened before, namely sort of going underground and into the alleys, happens because then you don't get in business. Is that the answer?
Yeah.
You guys are great for laws. So trying to get my head around. So what I'm getting from what you're explaining about the Nordic model and how it's
or my sexuality was wrong. And there's a lot about the way we talk about self-ownership coming from law analysis that would sort of lean towards that. But then when we say, yes, but you can't have this, you can't make this contract. Why? Am I hurting someone? No. But that's something you just can't sell. What is it about that thing that you can't sell? Why can't you sell it? So there suddenly it becomes common property, like there's a shared interest in stopping me from selling something of mine. That might make sense if it's not really mine. And that's why I'm saying maybe there's a background assumption about sexuality being social property somehow. Yeah, I had another thought. Good question. Yeah.
So if there's like no contract per se, like, sorry, what would you qualify rape in like the laws? You know, say like you don't get paid, it's like stealing sex, but wouldn't that be like rape in a sense?
Oh, that's an
And
interesting
if they
question.
can't make like a contract, like how you're gonna pay me?
So the final example I gave where Sam says, yeah, I agree to sex and I want to be paid, and Pat says, yeah, I agree to sex, and then Pat doesn't pay. So you're asking me what's going on there? Is that rape?
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of sex under false pretenses, right? You know, what have we really agreed to? There's a really interesting recent piece of case law in Nova Scotia, I think in Canada, where a person was convicted of sexual assault for something that might be parallel, which is this heterosexual couple that had been a couple, although things were rocky, and the woman was sort of talking like she was going to leave, but it was still kind of iffy. They had sex. There was no disagreement about having sex. They used a condom, but he pierced the condom. She got pregnant. Right? So that arguably was a case of sex under false pretenses. She thought she was having protected sex. He knew that there was a chance she would get pregnant. Right? So he was thinking, I'm having potentially reproductive sex. She was thinking, I'm having protected sex. She got pregnant. She had an abortion. And so something happened to her body that she hadn't planned on. And that actually went through as a case of sexual assault. So you might be able to claim that in the case of we make an agreement about what's going on, we're having sex for pay, and then you don't pay, then you've had sex under false pretenses. Yeah, but you couldn't prosecute very easily when there's this other background law says, yeah, but you can't expect pay because that's expecting somebody to do something criminal. Right.
So the person who prostituted are considered victims.
Yes.
So what about in the case of porn stars? Because they're being paid in order to do sexual acts on camera, and there is a customer base who's willing to pay in order to see those, and because they feel pleasure for it, should porn stars also be like categorized as sexual victims that are being prostituted? Like what makes like porn stars like okay in
That's a
society?
fantastic question. And you can be a star. You could be what they call a cam girl. Like somebody uses the internet and has a MasterCard thing or PayPal, right? Some people do this. Is that sex or not? Curiously, Chris mentioned when I did work on photograph pornography years ago, and this was in the 80s, and so there was a lot of, I would be in situations where I would be talking about my analysis, all very obscure and abstract, and then there'd be police there, and they'd talk about their take on things, and we were at this women's gathering, and the police were saying, oh, you know, if you see any pornography, pornography's awful. If you see any pornography, kind of popular. If you see any pornography, tell us, and you know, because it's illegal, and he'll scoop it up. It's like, what are you talking about? There's porn in every corner store. It was at the time. That's when we still had paper. It was mostly Playboy and Penthouse and stuff. And I said, oh, really? Where? are they pushing things in themselves? So this is interesting, because there has to be penetration by something for it to count as sex. I think that's kind of a background and also pre-internet model of what is sex. There has to be penises, and there has to be actual physical contact. So that's so far off the mark about the way that our world is now, where sexuality is. It's also in the internet, and there aren't always penises. So I think that's a really good question. I think that's the real consistency. Yeah. And the short answer is no. Pornography, being a pornography model or actor is not illegal. And being a stripper is not illegal. There used to be a special category of immigration for strippers, and we had a provincial minister at one point who said we had a stripper shortage. So they brought in particularly women from Eastern Europe. So it's just funny kind of inconsistency.
Is there any other questions for Dr. Davies? Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking her for being here. Thank you very much. Keep on staying. Not thinking there's another Chris.
Could relate to, you know, with schoolers and.
No, thank you.
Huge bus where they took in like 200 students or something, or 150 students from like, I think it was middle school, because they all just been like passing photos back and forth, and so I heard about it, and so like the FBI came in and like handcuffed all these like 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds.
As long as your stuff's safe, don't worry about any of that.
Thinking like this is so strange, just to get out and sending pictures of themselves, and so she was talking about.
This recently in our area.
Oh, really?
Yes. So what my daughter was in school.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
And it was.
Yeah.
Well,
And there's a parking lot right before you get to I always do
another girl disturbed her.
Oh, but it says it's
Because
over.
the kids were really,
Right.
all the same age.
Yeah, that,
Of course, and like,
So for the
when I was working
Yeah,
at
I've
Comps,
never seen it. Did it record? I've never seen it actually record. It always threatens you because it's scary.
well, it did, but I recovered it. The problem was, I set obviously every minute or something. And so I recovered it, and they were all jumbled up names. And for every paper I had
yeah, it's just such an
a thousand